So and that was just in response to, it was sort of a open topic catch Rachel night, something like that. And it was just the two of us. And we chewed hard for about 2 hours and quit.
I'm just saying it was very helpful to be able to jump in where I was in the series and like talk about that.
Nice, yeah. Very cool.
Also, I apologize for any movement in the back. I went to where one of the only places there is free public Wi-Fi. I am sitting in a McDonald's parking lot, so I promise I am not driving. The movement in the back is other people moving around me.
JP did. Sorry. Each other.
What did you say?
Telling me it's my fault.
Rachel, are you there?
Settle down.
Yeah, I'm there. Uncle Tom, you're underwater a little bit.
Underwater. I haven't heard it described that way. I can hear you okay, Rachel.
Okay, yeah, I can hear you fine. Uncle Tom is underwater.
I think it's Uncle Tom. Yeah. Oh, well.
Usually it's me.
Well, no, he actually, every once in a while, his internet goes out for some reason.
Yeah, I've been having the hardest time anytime I have to like hop on Zoom calls. A lot of the job application or job interviews I've been doing have been on like Zoom or Ring Central or one of those. And I've been back in my parents' house during COVID, and for the amount of adult people and the amount of devices that are there, we have nowhere near enough bandwidth. So I'm always like, please let me get through this interview.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, I'm always out here on cell service, so I'm usually pretty rough too.
Yeah. Now, remind me whereabouts while he's Uncle Tom, are you back with us? I don't think so.
Oh well, I'm out. If you want to Google Maps it, it's PD Oregon, PEDEE Oregon. And
is it in Monmouth?
Yeah, we're close to Monmouth. Yeah. Also, I'm literally like a few hundred yards away from the Dancing Oaks Nursery, which is my uncle's nursery.
Nice.
So you could look that up, and that would put you actually right where I work.
Sweet.
Yeah, so I'm just up on top of one of our hills here because I have 4G up here.
There you go.
Yeah. Normally when we do these podcasts, I'm just sitting in my car on top of this hill. But yeah. So it's
yeah, I was
walking. I literally just got back from running, so
nice. Yeah, I was in Shenandoah like a week or two ago with a few of my friends, and
nice.
Each had different cell providers, and it was always fun. We like basically repped our cell provider and was like, mine's better than yours. And all the mountain tops we went to, we counted how many bars people had where, and figured out over the course of all of the mountains who had the best mountaintop cell service, and it was aggressively not me.
What do you have?
I have Consumer Cellular, which is the one that is marketed to older Americans as like you can pay like $10 a month. But I like them fine. You can get them on, like, I like them fine. It's good. It's whatever.
Do you use a lot of data? Or
yeah, I have unlimited data, which is good. They didn't have unlimited data for years, but like within the last 2 years, they finally now do have unlimited data. And also like I get really good deals on phones from them. Like from the last time I saw you to now, I got a new phone. A new old phone. I got the 8 Plus. But I had the SE.
Oh, nice.
Yeah, I had the SE before that, and not the 2020 SE, the one from like 2015. So I had a very old phone. But yeah, I had to admit defeat to the. I had to admit defeat for my cell phone company in a pretty bad fashion. I wanted to FaceTime my dad from the top of Old Drag, and my phone didn't have any service, so I borrowed my friend Sailor's phone, and I was like, "You win. Can I use your phone?"
Would she have Verizon?
Yeah, she had Verizon, and my friend had AT&T, so they both were doing better.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah,
okay.
the only provider that has cell service out here is Verizon.
Interesting.
Like
All right, I see.
Oh,
sorry, go ahead.
No, is Uncle Tom almost back on here, or did he?
Yeah, Uncle Tom, can you hear us? We can hear you.
I can hear you.
Sweet.
Okay, I can hear you.
Yep, my Zoom is malfunctioning a little bit. But hey, Zoom takes a beating, you know. It's amazing to me that the thing hangs in there at all.
I'm kicking myself for not like investing or buying stock in Zoom. I don't know if they're publicly traded or anything, but if you had gotten in right before the pandemic, you had money.
True that.
Yep. So I've got a little dialogue box that tells me the meeting is being recorded, and it just won't quit, and it's sitting in front of my screen. And there seems to be nothing I can do to dissuade it. So
just really wants to remind you.
There is. That's right. Okay, so I've thrown it off to the side where it's reminding me in vain. Wow, JP, thanks for the breath of very nice.
There you go.
What's the word I'm looking for? Arboreal? What's the word?
Arboreal?
Arboreal sunshine.
Your phone's on your thumbs up, and it's funny.
Good. I needed that word because we needed something that captured the majesty of the moment there. Arboreal splendor. That's the phrase I was looking for. Nice.
This is Luke and Hazel's spot here. I don't know if you guys. So they got a kitchen over there. We cleared all this ground, and they stay in this tent overlooking a valley. Luke's over there writing code right now. I don't know if you can see him, but this is where I'm sitting right now. And they got their solar panels over there. Anyway.
I love it.
You definitely win the scenery game.
Yeah, that's right. Parking lot basement.
A McDonald's parking lot to contribute.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's see. JP, I'm thinking this evening that we kind of throw the topic your way. If there's something on your mind, I'm thinking we should chew on it together for a bit.
Yeah. I haven't. I'm sort of just getting settled back in here. I haven't really been thinking about anything in particular. Let's see. Yeah, I guess here's something I've been thinking about. I've been thinking about I've been thinking about the election some, and we're less than 100 days out, right? 3 months ish.
A little less now.
Is that right? 3 months from today, or 3 months from yesterday?
It was 100 days, like 4 or 5 days ago.
Okay. Yeah, and if I remember correctly, there were just some primaries recently. Is that right? From Senate seats, and a fair amount of mail-in voting happened, and it sounds like it went okay, which is good news compared to how it went earlier. So it'll be interesting to see how much that needs to happen and how much is done to facilitate that moving forward, particularly as we get to the general election. Yeah, because there's some there's certainly a lot of concerns about voting and people registering to vote, people's votes being counted, and the post office is getting somewhat gashed right now with regards to its funding, is my understanding. And so a lot of delays in mail now. So anyway, that's something I've been thinking about. It's something I've been concerned about since the pandemic started, was just how was voting going to work, because it was such a disaster. Wisconsin earlier in spring, in particular, is the one that comes to mind. So I don't know.
Sorry,
Have you guys read
what comes
anything?
to mind?
Wisconsin, the Wisconsin primary back in March, I think it was, late March. It was bad.
Or was it Iowa, which was even
Yeah, I
worse?
hadn't heard
the
about
Iowa
Wisconsin,
caucuses.
but they bungled Iowa.
Yeah, the caucuses, which were early on, nearly the first, maybe the first.
Well, Iowa's was a disaster. Wasn't there? That was an app issue, right? Iowa was before the pandemic, wasn't it?
Oh, you're talking about it got messed up because of the pandemic. Yeah, Iowa was pre-pandemic, or at least pre most people thinking about the pandemic.
Yeah. No, I'm talking about Wisconsin, which tried to do voting during the pandemic.
Right. The debacle there was the Supreme Court up. Let's see, how'd that go? Was it there was a partisan, there was partisan politics about whether or not to allow mail-in voting, and that went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court justice, maybe this is wrong, but my recollection is it was a Supreme Court justice who was himself on the ballot, the Republican elected Supreme Court justice, as that goes in Wisconsin. In other words, the Supreme Court members are elected in Wisconsin and some other states. Was one of the deciding votes in a close partisan election that did not allow for, that required in-person election under COVID, very long lines, very ticked off people.
Well, and a ton of
back to me.
polling stations were closed.
Pardon me?
My recollection is that a ton of polling stations were closed because people weren't willing to work. So like in Milwaukee, my recollection is that there was like normally 180 polling stations and it was down to like 10. And I thought the big ruling was that they wouldn't extend the deadline to count mail-in votes or to count absentee ballots, which are, I think those are the same thing, right? Absentee ballots and mail-in votes.
Absentee ballots are
in my mind,
in.
those are the same thing.
The only reason why some people draw a distinction between them, one is the absentee is a species of the genus mail-in, and the absentee, or I don't think these words are used precisely, but they're pulled in various directions. There's a spin on them, and sometimes a partisan spin on them. So you could have an unrestricted mail-in ballot, or you could have one that has conditions. And one of those sets of conditions is that somehow you are absent and not able to vote for whatever reason. So there are people who would use those differently, even though you mail them in. Yeah.
Uncle Tom, that is the most clearly I've heard anyone explain that distinction, and I've heard people tell me there's a distinction many times. So thank you for that clear and concise distinction, because I hadn't gotten one yet.
All right, thanks. Yeah. So anyway, I don't actually remember now the Wisconsin. Maybe I'm not even sure I ever knew it. The Wisconsin details. In other words, what precisely was not allowed in Wisconsin. I do remember a bunch of people lined up, socially distanced, in election situations where there was the flow rate just they could not accommodate the flow rate, and thus a lot of people feeling quite disenfranchised and pretty ticked off about it.
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't seem like we're going to be able to facilitate wide-scale mail-in voting.
Why do you say that?
Well, I just don't think that, I think because it's become partisan, and I think it actually is a pretty big logistical thing to set up quickly, it seems to me. That's the impression that people talking about it give. And I don't mean that I don't mean to say that, like, when I say that, I don't mean like concerns about fraud. I mean concerns about actually having the systems in place to send out, receive, and collect and count the mail-in ballots in a way that works in time for the election day.
Right.
People seem to be making a big deal about that's going to be impossible.
They are, and there's a lot of distinctions to be made into that, the impossible that. There are some states who are in good position to do it because that's how they vote.
Yeah, I live in one of those states.
That's what I thought. And Washington, your neighbors, just to the north, are another, right? Mm-hmm. That's how they vote. Let's see. Yeah, I don't remember California's particulars, but in the back of my mind, I'm thinking that California is a very liberal voting environment too, in that regard. So we should rehearse the candidate mechanisms involved, because there are distinctions to be made at every one of these, call them these gears that have to turn in order to make this whole thing, in order to get one person's preference all the way to a registered vote, right? What are the various gears that have to turn in between there if you're not literally pulling the lever or writing in a candidate, right? Or something that's sort of traditional in person. And even there, the gears are not simple, but they're also not so much in dispute right now, right? It's the gears when you're even further from the polling stations.
I actually, to jump in super quick there,
Sure.
I actually would disagree with that point a little bit. I think with the voting machines that are even used in voting booths, particularly in states that have not updated their systems in a long time, I'm thinking back to the Georgia primary. I think there are a lot of problems with even in-person voting getting counted correctly, but that's not what we're talking about right now. But I just wanted to jump that in there, because it's not just the mail-in voting that we're having these problems with, it's also the in-person.
I agree. It's just not filed under the mail-in voting woes. It's filed under something else.
Totally.
And you're right, Georgia, where the Secretary of State, who was himself on the ballot for governor, did not recuse himself from being in charge of managing the election. You can imagine. That's that's the situation in which Stacey Abrams tried to become governor. Didn't quite succeed, and yep, lots of complaints there.
Yeah.
But here's an important distinction that oftentimes get glossed over. You could imagine, and the post office is involved in a number of these things. You can imagine mailing everybody in your state something to put them in contact with the voting process. And then the question is, so that's sort of a universal element, universal mailing element. Well, what is it you're mailing? There's more than one thing you could mail, right? You could mail an application for a mail-in ballot to everyone, right? And then people have to fill out some information that has to be checked against some database and that has to be returned. Or you could imagine mailing out ballots to everyone, right? And you could imagine mailing out ballots out to everyone that you've got that you've got on your mailing list somehow. Everyone who is a registered voter, say. I mean, I suppose you could imagine.
It sure didn't take long for me to get my draft notice to sign up for the draft. I'll tell you that.
Good point. Yep. Smaller numbers, it must be admitted. Smaller numbers. But, and you could ask about the burden on the U.S. Postal Service if a state were moving to all of a sudden put a new system in place or put a system in place or implement a system in a short period of time. You could imagine, I suppose, there being some press on the Postal Service. Oftentimes what gets said, I think, is I've seen conflations and I've seen disputes over the conflations of the various things that are being mailed. So you might mail out to all registered voters applications for a mail-in ballot, right? Which might be confused with, and recently there was this HBO interview. Was that even yesterday or was it the day before?
The Axios one?
Older, yeah, it's older actually, but it was released yesterday, I think, and in the news yesterday. An interview between the remember the interviewer's name? I don't, but it was an HBO 35-minute interview with the president, and there was dispute between them when the president was talking about mailing ballots to everyone. And the interviewer was saying, well, wait, I mean, we're talking about mailing applications for ballots to everyone, right? That's a different deal.
Sorry, Tom, just to clarify, it's possible I haven't seen this interview. Are you talking about the Axios one with, I believe the journalist name was like Jonathan Swan or something like that?
Oh, you're right. That is the interview I'm talking about, and why maybe it was broadcast on HBO, and maybe I'm not picking that up, but it's definitely an Axios interview. You're right, and it was with Jonathan Swan.
Yeah, that was broadcast on HBO.
Okay, good. In any case, that issue came up very, very briefly. There was no time for distinctions really made. Swan tried to make it, but didn't get very far. So I think you got to look into the weeds there, and you got to look into what states already do. You got to look into how many gears are there in the mail-in portion there, because you've got a couple gears. If you've got to apply for the ballot and then receive the ballot and then send the ballot back in, right? All those have to work well. And is that something that's already set up? is that something that, well, there's a mechanism for it set up, but we're just going to increase the volume? Over how much time? Right? Those are all questions. And I think they're different state to state. So I think that this controversy requires more distinction than it's getting.
I would totally agree with that. And something that I've been seeing happening is I've been seeing the focus of the conversation get shifted, because the question of, do states have the logistical support to be able to effectively manage mail-in voting? That's like a totally valid question that deserves to be debated a whole bunch. But the trend I've been seeing happening is conversations getting bungled down with the president's claims that ballots themselves are getting mailed out to everybody, and then when people see that confronted against the information that that's not true, rather than the conversation being about, do we have the logistics for mail-in ballots, the conversation becomes about, oh, that statement is not true. The president must just be trying to like delegitimize mail-in voting. And then the conversation becomes like, should we have mail-in voting or not? Not, do we have the logistical support for mail-in voting? So something I see happening is whether because of or just in response to some of the falsehoods that are being spread currently, rather than having a productive conversation about how to put in the logistics / if the logistics already exist, that important conversation is not happening, because we find ourselves fighting about, like, is this a falsehood spoken by the president or not?
Yeah, that's nice. Well, it can be confusing. It was for me in the Indiana primary this year. I actually attempted to do mail-in voting. And I didn't pay attention to some of these distinctions. And so I sent in a request, but the request I was sending in, it turned out, and successfully, I had the request successfully processed, and I ended up getting an application for a mail-in ballot. That's what I ended up getting when I thought that perhaps I was asking for a mail-in ballot. Does that make sense? I mean, I myself failed to see that distinction. And as a matter of fact, failing to see that distinction and within the time allotted under the deadline, I applied for the application and received the application to apply for a mail-in ballot, but I did not allow myself enough time to execute that application for a mail-in ballot. So I had to vote in person in spite of the fact that I had this application for mail-in ballot, right? The first gear turned, but not enough, right? To get me all the way through to vote from home. So I had to go to one of, I believe it was 10 instead of 36 or so polling places in my county. There were 10, I think the number is 10 of them. Whatever it was remarkably smaller. And they're going to boost them up for the general election, but not to the number that they used to be. They're consolidating still. I will admit, though, that the big multi-precinct version that I voted in ran remarkably smoothly. It was. Yeah. Now this is South Bend, Indiana. This is not this is not New York City, right? But it, everybody's trying to make all these things work. And it was pretty wild. Everybody's standing in line with masks, socially distanced. We were inside for a long time. There was no line outdoors where I was, because it was a pretty darn big building, and you could wrap lines around it, which they did, socially distanced and masked. Masks were not required, actually, so not everybody was masked. Now this was earlier, before St. Joe County experienced a bit of a bump in COVID. That's another variable, right? So, JP, you grabbed a hornet's nest, pulled it down from the tree, and slammed it on the ground. Or a Pandora's box is maybe a better image than a hornet's nest. All kinds of things flying around.
Apparently, yeah, it will be. I mean, it seems like earlier on, people were certainly anticipating a bad second wave. And maybe what we're seeing now is the beginning of the second wave, but it seems like cases spiked a lot in the last few weeks, but now we're back down a little bit, even though the death numbers are still over 1,000 a day. Still be interesting to see what happens to those numbers moving forward. Like, will they continue to get worse? Who knows, you know?
I have my eye on schools for answering that question. Because a few counties across the country have gone back, but as we get deeper into August, more and more will likely be opening. And I think a lot of people are looking at that trend, how many schools wind up opening for in-person teaching, to see what that does to the case count.
Yeah. It's interesting, though. I mean, that's an enormously important question. And it gets to enfranchisement and disenfranchisement. It gets to, I suppose it even gets to fairness of the election. It gets to a lot of those things. But you know what it doesn't get to? It hasn't seemed to have gotten to this yet anywhere in any reporting at all. It hasn't gotten to fraud. It hasn't gotten to voter fraud. The voter fraud issue, that drumbeat, has been pounded on by the president from the very first, right? As soon as he was elected, he threw up a commission at day one, and that commission eventually folded shop, right? And cashed in their chips without anything to show for their efforts. Maybe I don't know enough about the particulars to be sure that story that gets told about the voter fraud commission is that simple. Maybe it isn't that simple, granted, because I haven't peered deep enough into it. But I remember the only thing that keeps me from being more certain about it is it was a while ago, because I followed the details at the time, and that was the impression that I had. It simply doesn't follow that because people can't get into lines. It may be voter, even disenfranchised. It may be irresponsible. It just doesn't follow that it's fraud. But the accusation that's floating around now is that it is the affiliation of absentee or mail-in ballots, right? Whether those are different or the same, or all the various versions of them, that all of that increases voter fraud. And can you point to anything anywhere that's been in the news where that's been alleged, where that's been documented, where it's been, I mean, it just seems to me it's an entirely different conversation that's pouring in on us from the top down only. It's pouring in from the president, actually. He's the only one talking about it. And people who echo, it seems to me, the president's line, I haven't seen it anywhere else. And unfortunately, he doesn't seem to have a good leg to stand on here. I don't know how this is not a bipartisan comment, because he threw up a commission to look at it, and that commission on its own cashed in its chips and walked away. And unless he's got a different account of how that happened, my impression is they walked away because they could not find widespread voter fraud. And unless somebody's got a different story to tell, then all that noise on voter fraud seems to be a distraction from a very serious group of issues about enfranchisement under COVID, which are complex and serious.
I think that idea of noise is really important, right? Because we have spent the last, just us specifically, have spent the last 25 minutes talking about the logistics of mail-in voting, but something we haven't debated or something we haven't really discussed ourselves much at all is mail-in voting important? And I think the reason we didn't do that is we jumped to like, or at least it was my impression that we jumped to, okay, mail-in voting is something that if it could be done correctly would be good. And we skipped the whole, is this an important thing that should even be looked at? But I think by throwing in the possibility of fraud and muddying those waters, rather than the discussion being, how do we do this thing safely? It rather becomes, how do we do this thing? And if you spend so much, I messed up my words there. Rather than the question being, how do we do this thing safely? It becomes, should we do this thing at all? And if you spend too long talking about, should we do this thing at all? By the time you come up with an answer to, should we do this thing at all? You have piddled away a bunch of time that could have been spent on the question. Once we decide, yes, this is something important that we do, how do we do this effectively so that we can make sure that this is done the right way?
So you want to make a case for mail-in voting?
I do. It is of my opinion that the focus on the fear, I guess, of widespread fraud in mail-in voting is a distraction from trying to from the logistics of getting mail-in voting right. I'd be actively interested in hearing somebody who themselves really believes that mail-in voting would be unsafe. I would love to sit down and hear more of the merits of that discussion, because admittedly I haven't heard anything that has risen. The only suggestions of there being widespread mail-in voter fraud that I've heard are the president asserting that there is without a lot of backup. If there is evidence out there, I'd love to hear it or talk with somebody who this is a genuine belief they have. But from what I have seen thus far, that's what this issue looks like to me, an effort to muddy the waters and take away valuable time from figuring out how logistically we could have mail-in voting.
Yeah.
And I guess to clarify my point a little bit, I'm not necessarily saying that this is an intentional attack on the ability to discuss mail-in voting and the logistics of it in an effective way. I'm not necessarily saying that it's being done on purpose to muddy those waters. I think that could be in the realm of possibility, but I haven't definitely decided that's what's happening. But a definite byproduct of what's happening is we are losing valuable time. Whereas if we were able to go in with if we were able to do mail-in voting safely, that would be something that was important to us. If we could start at that baseline, we would have had a lot of time into trying to figure out how logistically we could do this in a way that would make sense.
Sure. Look at Nevada, who got around to it, right? And in fact are being sued. Right? Being sued by the president, or at least threatened to be sued. Whether they're actually being sued or not, I have not followed up on. But they're threatened to be sued.
I'm not super familiar with that
I think
situation.
he threatened to sue.
Can you give me the spark notes of that? I'm not super familiar with that situation.
Yeah, that was just not many days ago. I would say, I got to remember what day we were in this week. We're all the way to Wednesday. That might have even been Monday of this week, unless it was Friday of last week in the news cycle.
I think it was Monday.
Yeah.
I read about that on the plane, I think.
Okay. So Nevada, let's see, can I actually give the spark notes? Caveat.
The state legislature passed basically legislation that allowed statewide mail-in voting. And I think it was signed by the...
Yeah, that sounds right. And the president threatened via Twitter legal action. he said it was done in the dark of night. It was an attempt to steal the election to make it impossible for Republicans to win. I think language like this is the language I saw, I'm recalling in the tweet.
Governor.
You're saying, John, that
The language,
was the governor?
Well, I think it was, but I think the language of if we allow mail-in voting, Republicans will never win another election in this country again. I mean, that is a real quote, but that from Trump, but I think that one's earlier in the spring.
Oh, I see. It's possible that I'm conflating something that was, so I picked it up in that news cycle, but it's possible it was dragged in from something earlier, right?
Yeah. That was earlier this spring, like or something. But people bring that up because in this story, because it shines a light on what people are using it to basically say that the president is just worried about basically this being good for Democrats. And the only way for Republicans to win is to suppress the vote. Even though there isn't actually evidence of mail-in voting significantly helping a particular party.
That's good. That's fabulous news.
So I got to throw in a piece in response to your general. You're opening the door, Rachel, to the question of why mail-in voting. What's the actual reason for it? And I guess I want to say two things about it. One is it not obvious that mobility is a challenge for a lot of people? Is that just not flat obvious? Mobility for all kinds of reasons, right? Because they're older, it's hard to get around. Because they're working two jobs and it's hard to get across town. There's all kinds of mobility challenges like that, right? That cut across. So mobility, let's just say, is an issue, right? And of course, if you can cut out, that's exactly what mail does, right? You don't have to actually show up in person. So it addresses a mobility challenge. But what's somehow getting me to seethe just a little bit underneath is the history of intentional disenfranchisement in the United States. We've got a very rich history of intentional disenfranchisement, which is shamefully practiced to this very day, layered on top of the history that we've had, which was not hidden, which was straightforward, right? Which was comically perverse. And again, one of my favorite dives into this piece of history, I've made this point before to you, JP, is the Summer of Freedom, I believe it's called, that Summer of Freedom documentary about the formation of the Mississippi Democratic Freedom Party in 1968. Just one window into the history of intentional disenfranchisement and efforts to get around it. And that, honestly, that is pure, unabashed racism, complete hypocrisy and violation of the law. It is as ugly as it ever gets, and it has been present all over the place in the history of the United States, and it still gets practiced in a way that doesn't, I think, it's a good question whether how much good do you do to draw the connections between very emotionally charged and very ugly historical precedents with contemporary instances, right? In some ways, it seems deeply unjust not to make the comparisons, not to draw the lines, right? But on the other hand, you get both heat and light when you do that, right? There's no question you get heat with the light. So I'm not saying that's a simple piece, but I suppose the way to do it is for me not to seethe when I think about those sorts of disenfranchisements, and to cool down, right, and nonetheless bring them in, right, but bring them in not inflammatory ways, and say, look, we have in fact had this long history, and we continue to practice this long history, and we practiced it in the last election in comically ugly and manifest ways, where we've intentionally at the last minute changed the polling place in a fairly mid-sized American city and moved it all the way across town and told hardly anybody about it, right? Which happened in one city that I'm simply, because we're in public, given the very tiny chance that I remember that city wrong. I think I know what city it is, but I'm not going to mention it. But so let me just talk about my emotional reaction. And sorry, I did have an emotional reaction. It was ugly, right? It was ugly, and it seems to me that's the right human reaction. But because it is intentionally disenfranchising, and you've got to bring those things in. How do you not talk about mobility when mobility challenges are a gauntlet in some cases, which have been intentionally thrown down, and in other cases, if they're not intentionally thrown down, they're very real, right? How about people that? How about the entire disabled voting population of the United States? How about the American Disabilities Act, the ADA? How about that whole movement? And doesn't that have anything to do with voting? Seems to me that it does, right? And of course, you've got to make those things easier for people. And then how do you not make them? How do you not at least pay attention to the possibility of COVID, right? As being relevant to the mobility issue, because mobility requires people riding buses, standing in lines, et cetera, of all kinds of different preconditions. And do you really mean to disenfranchise all those people?
I mean, the cynical answer is definitely yes.
Well, yeah, and that
hurts.
that's flatly wicked, right? That's not politics. That is not any legitimate political choice of means. And when the other guys do it, the other guys might stuff the ballot box. It does not legitimize your stuffing the ballot box, nor does it legitimize your disenfranchising voters because somebody else does it. There are some lines that you cannot cross, or you have made a mockery of the political process. And it seems to me we cross way too many of those lines, and we're crossing them all over the place in these issues right now.
And it makes me think of a lot of the ways that individuals or organizations have tried to address disenfranchisement of voters. So, for instance, like nonprofits or even just individuals who on election day will drive other people and advertise that they can drive other people to polling places. That is becoming less safe because of COVID. So a lot of the like piecemeal strategies that individuals have put together to try and address the problem because it's not being addressed from a top-down method. A lot of those are becoming less practical or even dangerous during COVID. So that's something that definitely concerns me. And also the fact that a lot of our election workers are typically older Americans. And I've seen a call for an increase of young people to try and work the voting booths on election day. And I think that's a really important step because it can help protect people who are more vulnerable. But it does.
Voting day, which is a Tuesday, not a Saturday, right? Voting day, which is one day, not 2 days. All sorts of things which are deliberately kept in place.
Yeah,
in spite of the difficulties, the disenfranchisement implications.
It bothers me that, I mean, yes, it's important to do what you can do as an individual to help address the situation, but it does bother me that a lot of the things we have to do to address the situation, like individuals driving other people in the community to the polls, that things like that happen because it's not being addressed from above. It makes me think of how, like, I'm going to use a climate change parallel. It makes me think of like chastising individuals for using plastic straws when corporations are like polluting like crazy. Which, like, yes, it's important to do what you as an individual can do to help, but there's a huge power dynamic there. So it is my wish that disenfranchisement could be, that it didn't have to just be addressed from what can I as an individual in the society do. I wish the powers that be could use their infinite greater power to address this issue. And even me saying I wish they could, I recognize they totally can. They just have not.
They won't. And so at some point, wish is not enough. Right? I mean, at some point, when people won't do the right thing down the road, you have to act.
Yeah, but like the thing that I'm thinking about is, like, yes, it's awesome to like do what you can do as an individual, but I have a hard time just accepting that like disenfranchisement will never be addressed by people in positions of power. Like, I understand, like, that's what I think. I don't think they're going to address it at the moment, but like sitting, like, that really isn't great. That's my like perspective of what's going to happen. Like, I understand that, like, that anger, that it won't be addressed by people who can systemically enfranchise people rather than disenfranchise them. It's not helpful to be like, for me to be angry that they're not doing that, but also like I think I like absolutely have the right to be angry that that's not happening, and to not accept that they're just not going to.
Well, you might think that in a democracy, a commitment to enfranchisement is a fundamental civic obligation. That's something I don't think we hear a lot about, our civic obligations, right? Sometimes you hear that we have an obligation to vote, that there's some civic obligation, a civic duty, right, to vote. But it seems to me you also have a civic duty to promote enfranchisement. And that means to act not only to drive your neighbor to the polls, but to change the circumstances in which it is darn near impossible for your neighbor to get to vote, right? In which perhaps you can heroically do something and you should, perhaps, right, for your neighbor. But we should also work to change those circumstances. I mean, we should, and that's, of course, that's not happening. I shouldn't say that. It's happening here and there all over the place. Sometimes it's at some scale, right? There are people who work on voter drives, for example, right, to register lots of people, make registration easier, and we all enjoy the fruit of that. Actually, we in Indiana enjoy the fruit of it. It's remarkable. I mean, Indiana's actually done a good job in that regard in voter registration. When they made the Motor Voter Act, they basically made it as easy as if you register to drive a car, you can register to vote in the same sort of way, and you don't have to do it you don't have to make separate trips, and there may be some criticisms of that particular thing, but I think it encourages people to vote. So,
I mean,
well,
I'm just surprised. Like,
yeah.
I'm surprised. This is just occurring to me now, but I'm surprised that just given everything that I mean, I just feel like progressives are just shouting this from the rooftops about enfranchisement, and they're just that's just being shouted from the rooftops right now from the Democratic Party and from the progressive wing in particular, and painting the Republican Party as the party against this and against it in principle, practically. But I'm surprised. I mean, given that this has been an issue for so long, I mean, why hasn't, I mean, like during the beginning of Obama's presidency, there was, I mean, they had the Democratic Party had control of the House and the Senate and the presidency. And it seems to me that there would be, given the current narrative in the Democratic Party, there'd be no sure way towards political power than enfranchising more people, which is basically what they're saying. The only way the Republican Party wins now is by disenfranchising people. And maybe that's just a development in the last few years, but the narrative is interesting to me now because this is just I'm just thinking of this. I mean, why didn't, if that would have just ensured their continued success, I mean, why wouldn't that be like at the top of the docket? I mean, why is this just being really hammered in now when I feel like there have been opportunities to do something more substantial earlier? Maybe that's not representing the situation fairly, but
no, right. I understand the question, and I don't have the grasp of the particulars to even start to answer it. I mean, you'd have to look at what actually was done. You'd have to look. Yeah, you'd have to look at that. I know that disenfranchisement historically has not been just a one-party story. It's what power does to maintain power, and power is shifted. So I'm not trying to make this a partisan issue, although it might be.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not either. I'm not either. That's just the conversation right now. I wish that wasn't the way it was, but
right.
It is right now, certainly.
Yep. No, it's a good question. I mean, the short version, a short sketch of 2008 was pick your big issue and go after it. And they picked healthcare. Right. And we're still fighting about that. We're still fighting about it because the guy I didn't vote for, Barack Obama, who said that polarization between parties was the biggest problem, but had never done anything in the Senate that I ever saw, didn't have the experience base to actually make cross-aisle compromise. That guy wandered into this big problem and gave up on it. He got hammered. He was out of his depth, out of his league, and so he ramrodded healthcare down the throat of the Republicans, really dooming it to very long-term controversy. And I'll be honest, seeing that coming is why I voted for John McCain as the lesser of two evils, or the better of two people to confront the worst of our problems. Because I thought, at the very least, McCain had the experience to cut across party lines and make things happen. And there I had McCain-Feingold in mind, which was a campaign finance reform efforts. So, and I'm not trying to get behind any of that. JP, you've heard me use it the Punch and Judy show for the Democratic and Republican stage play in American politics. So I'm not. So I want to back off paying too much attention there. But I did have to pick my poison, and I picked John McCain in those days, and for right reasons. Although I was particularly delighted when Barack Obama was elected for other reasons. I was really delighted. It was a great thing for America in a lot of ways. But it wasn't a great thing from the point of view of overcoming political differences, because he did not have the gravitas, he did not have the experience neither to pull that off. And yet we elected him anyway. If you wanted to perpetuate the infighting, you might have promoted a candidate. But there I go down a dark rabbit hole, right, of how presidents are kept.
This is a slightly off-topic question,
Yeah.
kind of chasing down a rabbit hole. Is there anyone that you see in American politics today that you think, or like whether or not they're in the conversation, like for president for 2020 or anything, is there anyone that you think does have the gravitas and experience to like be effective in helping reduce polarization?
Well, you need gravitas. That's helpful. You need to have had some experience and experience that people have seen. They need to know you have some experience, because you need to generate some trust, because you need to be able to bring some people to the table.
Yeah.
So you got to have stable principles. There's a character development here. You got to be committed to it. You have to have been involved in it. You have to have achieved results in pursuit of it, and not made so many enemies in the. You have to have survived politically through that very difficult effort of trying to make change in a bipartisan way. So, in our current environment, we don't raise a crop of those people, right?
That was my follow-up question.
Yeah, we don't raise that crop. As a matter of fact, we cut them off. I've watched it happen, actually, very, very close hand. I've watched national politics eat politicians and make of them campaigners and make of them sailors on the political seas that reduce their level of integrity. Because otherwise you won't get certain people to play with you, and you can't win without those people. And that's what happens when national political machines come to local politics. That's a short version of it, and I'll leave names out, but I've seen that, and I think that's how it works. So in that environment, it's difficult to raise people with principle and people who are willing to cut across both sides. I've been a big Tulsi Gabbard fan for that reason. I think she marches to a different drum, and whether or not I like everything she ever does, although as a matter of fact, when I look hard, I generally do like the things that she does. And I think
I
that
saw
a lot
her
of
in New Hampshire.
You did. Wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, when I was living in Vermont, I was like 25 minutes from where Dartmouth College is, and given the fact that that's a prominent institution in New Hampshire, one of the first states to vote, all the presidential hopefuls go to New Hampshire. I saw like 3 or 4 of them speak.
Cool.
Yeah, I enjoyed her talk. I think she is a good example of someone who is willing to kind of reach across both sides. And I actually got an opportunity to talk with her a little bit, just the two of us, which was really cool. And I asked her about that specifically. And we got into a pretty rich conversation, and she just had a lot of advice to give. And this is clearly something she has focused a lot of her career on doing.
It's nice. So she's one. And then I was a Justin Amash fan also in some respects, because I think Amash also I don't know if you know him. He was the one independent in the, he was the independent from Michigan who voted for impeachment. If I don't know if you followed that, it's just one place you might have seen him. He just showed up as a number on a screen in that particular case. Justin Amash was a founding member of the Freedom Caucus and a fairly conservative player. And you hear different stories, and you'd have to know the man to know what actually happened, and I don't. But certainly what happened in public is that he read a lot of the things that he read, for example, the whole Mueller report. And he said, hey, this guy deserves to be impeached. This is bad stuff. And that he didn't last long as a Republican with that view, and he became an independent. But he put his hat in the ring as an independent in this last election. And he has been somebody, it seems to me, who was willing to take a principled stand against his own party. Now, it's very, let's see, you can quite cheaply and quite disingenuously take a principled stand when it's convenient to you, especially if you're young enough, right, and can get away with it. That, however, is not his reputation. I mean, there were people in the Freedom Party after he shifted gears who said that guy's got more principle than anybody I've ever met, right? This is actually a principled guy. So maybe, I mean, maybe he's the real deal. It's very hard to tell the real deal. You got to be real, not only in your commitment, right? But you have got to have survived and been effective and gathered some alliances because of that. That's the modern day political task. I mean, I was a Pete Buttigieg fan because I watched him as mayor, and he has a lot of what I just described.
He was the next name I wanted to throw in.
Yeah, he does have a lot of that.
But he doesn't have the experience yet.
I think that's true, and I think his particular strategy is a dangerous one. His strategy is to do what you can at the national level, and of course he's weighing the possibility that the national level is simply too corrupt to begin there, right? And if you try moving in that space, you find yourself relegated to certain kinds of choices that are not the choices that are going to promote growth as an effective bipartisan player. I think that that's the case, and frankly, I was disappointed ever since. Ever since he rose, I don't mean about everything he says, but consistently disappointed in instances here and there, in ways in which I was not disappointed when he was local. I didn't see those kinds of disappointments. I didn't see him have to become a partisan hack. And I don't mean to say that with too much disrespect. I have no disrespect for it. But I do think that there are moments where you become something like a partisan hack when you play the game that's played in partisan politics. You attack at weak points. You undermine other people's reputations. You pay less attention to what's actually the case and way more attention to what is going to be seen and taken away in the news cycles. And at some point, a leader's got to resist that stuff. And you don't practice that stuff at the national level. You practice that stuff at the local level, and you grow. And you grow in your capability, you grow in your resolve, and you resist the whole time, and you pass up political prizes because you can only take them by affiliating with the wrong people around the wrong principles. Even if in some ways, you end up ends justifying the means, crossing over all kinds of principles that you ought never to cross over. You play that game long enough and you start disenfranchising people and stuffing ballot boxes. I'm not accusing any particular party of doing that, but that stuff has been, it's not a partisan deal, it's a power deal. So anyway, that I think we need that, and I think it's very difficult. We need a political movement, a long political principle, and it has got to be. I mean, just think about it. These are the skill sets you develop in a high information flow network of communities. Right? It is precisely the ability to listen to other people and enter into and value and respect their role in articulating, even helping to articulate with them, for them, their position, right? That's adult behavior. It's adult behavior if you see adulthood it's actually minimally functioning in a healthy sort of environment. And we just don't have those sorts of environments. We don't recognize them, we don't grow them, we don't foster them. I don't mean they never get fostered. There are civics classes in some high school somewhere, right, where this is fostered like crazy, right? And there's leadership classes and there's all sorts of things. And hopefully those people grow up and they resist the corrupting influences of big stream politics. So I'm sure it happens. But boy, you have to look around and ask who can you see on the horizon who's leading here? And the answer is practically nobody. But anyway, long story. We should, JP, thanks for raising this issue. We'll have to come back to it at some point.
Yeah, I mean, this is the story for the next 90 days, you know?
It is. It won't be the last time. Yeah, it's a big story.
And that's it. After that, it won't be a story anymore.
Politics ends November 9th, 8th? I don't know. One of those days. 12th?
First Tuesday. Yeah, I don't know when it
is. The third, I think.
Yeah, couldn't be the
9th.
Oh,
okay. Yeah. Early this year.
First Tuesday. Yeah. All right. Well, thanks, guys. I should, JP, thanks for hanging in after a run. You've dutifully hung in. So.
Oh man, this was great. I'm glad we were able to make something out of nothing there. I was grasping for straws. That was great, you guys.
Well, you've been investing for years, and so you just reach in and pull something out from the storehouse. So.
Yeah.
Like a good cook, right? When guests come over for dinner suddenly.
Yeah. Go to the old faithful. Yeah.
Yep.
Disenfranchisement.
Thanks.
Can always count on that.
We're talking
oh
Friday.
Boy. Bleak way to end it.
All right. I'll see you guys Friday.
Yep.
All right.
Maybe.
Thanks, guys.
If we're doing it.
Yep. We're doing it. Yep. Bye.